What makes a Danganronpa execution theme? How do they just fit the characters so well? How crazy was I when I made that intro? All questions that will be answered in this video. It should go without saying, but spoiler warning pretty much for the entirety of Danganronpa. There's not much I can do about this one. Firstly, purely for that intro alone, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really helps, genuinely. So, execution themes, those themes that we hear when our beloved or less beloved character departs from the Danganronpa universe, and we no longer get to see their face again. Now for me, the best starting point is to talk about how the themes are similar. Now we know that there's a base punishment theme. When I say a base punishment theme, I mean there are core elements that are the same in every execution theme. And then of course there are additional quirky features related to the individual characters that are layered on top or weaved into the entire arrangement. So let's start by talking about how the execution themes are similar. So they all start with a drum beat, naturally. And interestingly, the drum beat is the same throughout DR1, but in DR2 and DR3, a slightly different one with a more splashy snare sound is used. Secondly, there's always going to be a synth which is sidechain compressed to the bass, which sounds like this. Now, to link the intro section with the climax section, we typically have a riser, and the riser sounds like this. Often it's the case that there's electric guitars in the background playing power chords. And finally, who could forget the vocal samples, which is pretty much inevitable in every execution theme. Although the actual specific vocal sample changes depending on the theme. This particular sample is actually from a sample library called Voices of Passion by East West, which I happen to own, and I've gone through and tried my best to recreate the vocal sample that's in Danganronpa execution themes a while ago. The link is in my Patreon, but you don't have to be a patron to be able to download it. Hope this helps. Now, if you've watched any of my other analysis videos, like all of these ones, you'll know that I often talk about the key signature of a piece. For all execution themes, it's a little bit problematic or trickier, purely because a lot of the pieces actually change key signature within themselves. But here's a rule of thumb of how to work out the key signature of any execution theme. If there are these Bulgarian vocals, then the key is in A minor. If we have a different vocal sample, such as Cody or Clyde or Reach for the Stars or anything else, then the key is in C minor. There are two big exceptions, which are the Kyoko and Makoto execution themes, which are both in F minor. Now you'll notice so far that every execution theme I've mentioned is in a minor key signature. And this is a good point to start talking about how the themes are different. Because there's actually one theme which, at least for the second half of the entire execution theme, is actually in a major key signature. So let's start with the execution theme, which I think in some ways does it the best in terms of representing the character, and that is Celeste. Now, in terms of the most memorable execution video, I'm sure we can kind of all agree that it's one of the most memorable ones, especially for the anti-climax and the contrast and Celeste smiling throughout the entire thing. The smiling's the interesting thing because I think the fact that she's executed in such a way that suits her, at least the beginning of the execution does, demonstrates why the piece is in a minor key. We have instrumentation, which completely supports Celeste as a character, particularly that harpsichord in the background. And the really interesting thing is the contrast of the beginning of the execution, where we hear atonal cinematic strings and synth sounds, versus the end, which feels much more thematically appropriate for a character like Celeste. Now sadly, we must talk about Kaede's execution because we can't deny that it suits her incredibly well. The biggest thing that we start off with is the piano playing a very consistent low A throughout the entire opening of the track. Of course, then we move into the very detuned version of the flea waltz. I think it's interesting choosing a dance effectively, or a waltz, and Kaede's movements in the entire execution theme seeming a bit like a dance as well. Of course, there's the irony of Kaede playing all the wrong notes, Now you might be wondering why I'm bringing up this next execution theme. It's not necessarily the most iconic in the world, but for a start, it's the first time we hear "Reach for the Stars." Now truth be told, there isn't too much to say about this besides the obvious. After all, many of the elements in the track go some way to explain the execution itself as opposed to Teru Teru as a character, but the key things I'd point out in terms of differences between Punishment Rocket from DR1 and the execution themes from DR2 and V3 is that, okay, we have the Reach to the Stars sample, we have the sample, and then we also have the helicopter sounds as well, alongside filtered vocals to make it seem like it's a helicopter pilot. While we're on the subject of small things that represent characters, I think it's a good point now to bring up Peko. Again, not the most unique in terms of the actual execution theme, but it's worth calling out the Japanese choir at the beginning, which I do feel like represents her quite well in some regards. Chiaki Nanami. I don't think I need to say any much more than that, to be honest. I think we all know what we're talking about. One of my personal favourite characters, and it's the dictionary definition of an execution theme which perfectly matches her as a character. Let's listen. So of course the big thing in relation to this execution theme is the use of retro synth sounds, because obviously Chiaki is a gamer. But the thing I find particularly interesting is it doesn't go over the top, and this is the thing with all of the execution themes. It's really tempting when you're given the brief, for example, to do something that represents a character, to make it so obvious and in your face. But there's an element of not going too far with this. I divide the retro synth sounds into 3 parts. The most obvious thing you hear is that plucked synth sound in the mid-range of the entire piece. That's just acting as the kind of way of setting the context. Secondly, you have that triangle wave that's imitating the bass line for this particular track. And then thirdly, towards the end, we have the lead synth come back in and start imitating the vocals from Monokuma's theme, which I think is really interesting. Now there's definitely other stuff going on, like distorted and detuned synth sounds, for example, to represent the gamer in Chiaki. But I think overall it does a fantastic job of being clear, setting the tone, establishing and being fit for Chiaki as a character, but not going too far. Now I have to confess, I wasn't a huge fan of this next character, but I admit that their execution theme characterizes them so perfectly. And in a way that's not so upfront as many of the others, it's a little bit more subtle. You have instrumentation which blends into their character incredibly well, but it's not shoved in your face. Now in terms of execution themes, where the video itself reflects the character's entire existence, I think Kyo is the perfect example of this, and therefore the music reflects that perfectly too. In this case, we have Japanese instruments reflecting the cultural melting pot that is Kyo's entire existence. There are 2 particular standouts here. First of all, we have the wind instrument, the shakuhachi, which sounds like this. And secondly, we have the katsuzumi, which is almost like a talking drum, which sounds like this. The combination of both of these, but also Takada not going overboard with them, I think perfectly helps to reflect Kyo as a character. Now the last execution theme we're going to talk about is one which utilizes vocal samples a lot. Now again, I may not have been a huge fan of this particular character, don't sue me, but at the same time, their execution theme summarizes them so perfectly, in a way that kind of, if you were to imagine an execution theme for this character, then this is the sort of thing I think you would imagine quite straightforwardly. Now there are 3 particular things which stand out from Gonta's execution theme in terms of the music. 2 of them being thematically appropriate, in fact it fits Gonta perfectly, and the third just being an interesting observation. The first one is the banjo. Now, given the Wild Wild West country setting of the execution and Gonta himself, it completely makes sense. I question whether it was actually a banjo at all, because I noticed in the original execution theme, the banjo starts on a note which is actually out of range for the banjo. So the best I could do is to try and recreate it is to take the banjo's lowest note and pitch shift it downwards to imitate the one from the original. Now the second is the obvious one, the vocal sample, which is Clyde from a vocal pack. And the third one that I noticed, and it's more of just an interesting thing, is the timpani that appears at the end. It sounds very impactful, very big, very prominent. Almost ironic given Gonta's personality on some level. And I find it a really interesting thing as a whole in terms of these execution themes. If an execution theme can't adequately present a character, then I think the problem isn't necessarily with the theme, the problem kind of is with the character. I think Danganronpa characters are so unique that they naturally lend themselves to these incredible execution themes that have this unique characterization and personality attached to them. In my view, you should be able to listen to the first 30 seconds of an execution theme and immediately pinpoint what character that relates to. Special thanks to my patrons, Red Fluffy, PWL, Jeff the Hero, Andrew Dunn, Omar, Randvar, Snowy Snowish, Stratusfire, and Hylia.